The sound of the phone ringing was the only thing that cut through the silence in my apartment. I stared at the screen. Dad. My heart skipped a beat, a mix of confusion and hesitation flooding me. It had been months since we last spoke. Ever since he remarried and started a new family, everything changed. Hello, I answered cautiously, not sure how to sound. Do I sound normal, or does the resentment seep through in my voice? How's everything going, kiddo? Dad's voice was warm, but it wasn't the same. It was as if the distance between us had widened over the years. I tried to ignore the knot that tightened in my stomach at the sound of that word. Kiddo. It used to bring comfort, a sense of being his little girl. Now, it felt like a reminder of the distance he'd put between us. Good, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, hiding the hurt that simmered beneath. Busy with work? You know how it is. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a familiar silence, one that only seemed to grow since the divorce. The phone calls were brief now. Sometimes they were just for a check-in. Other times they were hollow exchanges with no real substance. He'd always been busy, but now it felt like he was too busy, as though his life had filled up with more important things. And somehow I had become less of a priority. How's everything with your new family? I asked, the words almost leaving my mouth before I could stop them. I wasn't sure why I phrased it that way. Maybe I was bitter, or maybe I was just trying to get him to acknowledge the truth of what had happened. There was an awkward chuckle from the other side of the phone. Things are great. Sarah and the kids are settling in well. They're really adjusting. You should come over sometime, maybe meet up for dinner. Dinner. The invitation felt as empty as the air between us. I'd already met his new wife, and I'd met his stepchildren once, but there was never any real connection. The reality was clear. His new family had become his focus, while I was left to pick up the pieces of my own life. I don't know, I replied, my voice quieter now. I've been kind of busy, with work and stuff. Yeah, sure, Dad said, his tone shifting slightly. I could almost hear him mentally moving past me, onto something else, someone else. Look, I need to go. We're having some folks over tonight. Just wanted to check in. Let me know if you change your mind about dinner. His words trailed off, like they always did. I nodded silently, even though I knew he couldn't see me. I will. Talk soon. But even as I said it, I didn't know when that would be. I didn't know if we would talk again. I didn't know if it mattered anymore. I ended the call and sat on my couch, staring at the empty space in front of me. The void between us had only grown with time. My heart felt heavy with a sadness I couldn't shake off. It wasn't just the cutting off, it was the subtle, consistent way he had distanced himself from me. Every birthday, every holiday, every important milestone, my father had chosen his new family instead. They were everything now, and I was just a memory. I ran my hands through my hair, trying to push away the feeling of abandonment. He had made it clear. His new family was his priority, and while it hurt, I had learned to live without his support, without his presence. I had become someone else, someone who could survive without him. But sometimes, like today, I couldn't help but wonder how things could have been different. The doorbell rang. I pushed my thoughts away, stood up, and opened the door. A package from my mentor, Dr. Mitchell, had arrived. Inside was an invitation to an exclusive conference on neurogenesis, the breakthrough research I had been working on for months. It was the validation I needed to remind me that my hard work was paying off, that I was moving forward even without my father. But as I held the invitation in my hands, something in me broke. It was a reminder of everything my father had missed, everything he had chosen not to witness. And for the first time in a long while, I felt that old wound open again. He wasn't there, he never was. But I had come so far without him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The weeks passed in a blur. The conference invitation sat on my desk, staring at me every time I entered my apartment. But I couldn't bring myself to RSVP. The excitement that should have come with the opportunity felt hollow, like an empty room with nothing but echoes. My father's absence was more than just a physical void. It was emotional, a constant reminder of how everything had changed. I buried myself in my work. My lab experiments were demanding, but they were the only thing that kept my mind distracted from the pain that lingered in the corners of my life. Research on neurogenesis, exploring new ways to stimulate brain cell regeneration after injury. It was groundbreaking, and it was mine. For the first time, I felt like I had something that was entirely my own, something I had built without anyone's help. But still, every milestone I reached felt less meaningful because I couldn't share it with him. No congratulatory texts, no phone calls, no "I'm proud of you." The silence from my father was deafening. Then, one day, I received an email. Dr. Mitchell had forwarded me a message from a prestigious research program at Johns Hopkins, one I had been eyeing for years, the Patterson Fellowship. They wanted to meet me. The opportunity was more than I had ever dreamed of. It would give me the funding, the exposure, and the mentorship I needed to take my research to the next level. It was the kind of recognition that could change everything. And yet, all I could think about was my father. When I called him to tell him about the fellowship, there was no excitement in his voice, no spark of interest. Just the same emptiness that had been there for months. His response was a tired, "That's great, kiddo," as if the news didn't matter. He was too busy with his new family to care, too preoccupied with the life he'd built without me. "That's it?" I asked, the question hanging in the air like a threat. "You're not going to ask me how I feel about it? You're not going to tell me you're proud?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, finally, he spoke. "I've got to go. Sarah's waiting for me. We're having dinner with her parents." And that was it. The call ended with him hanging up, and I sat there, phone still in hand, staring at the blank screen. The familiar sting of rejection hit me like a wave, pulling me under. It wasn't even about the fellowship anymore. It was about him. It was about all the years of sacrifices and hard work I had put into making something of myself without his help, only for him to barely acknowledge it. Later that week, I received another text from him, one that stung even more than the phone call. "Congrats on the fellowship, but I hope you know I'm here if you need anything. Just know Sarah and the kids come first now." The words were an admission of what I already knew, but reading them in black and white made it feel like a knife had twisted deeper into my chest. I wasn't angry, at least, not at first. I was numb, as I had been for so long. But the text felt like a final seal on the truth. I was never going to be his priority again. I tried to push it down. I told myself it didn't matter. I had succeeded without him after all. This wasn't about needing him. But deep down, it was hard not to feel the sting of that final confirmation. His new family was the one he cared about. And I was just an afterthought. The following weeks saw me diving further into my work, chasing the validation that had always been so elusive. The Patterson Fellowship was everything I'd ever dreamed of. My research had the potential to change lives, to save lives, and yet there was a growing ache within me that no amount of professional success could fill. One evening, just as I was leaving the lab, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my younger sister Katie, who still lived in our hometown. "You won't believe this," she wrote. "Dad's going all out for the family Christmas this year. He's even invited your ex, the one who you always hated." I rolled my eyes. My ex had always been a touchy subject. He was the one my father had wanted me to be with. And when that relationship fell apart, my dad hadn't exactly been supportive. He'd barely acknowledged the breakup, too focused on his new life. Katie continued, "I told him about your fellowship, and he didn't even seem to care. He was too busy talking about the new car he bought for Sarah's son." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The emptiness in my chest seemed to expand with every word. He had been so proud of me when I was younger, when my successes were smaller and less meaningful. But now I was just another person in the background. It wasn't just the lack of acknowledgement. It was the realization that no matter what I achieved, I would always be second in his eyes. And yet, there I was, on the verge of the biggest achievement of my life, and all I wanted was for him to look at me, just for a moment, and see his daughter, the one who worked her ass off to get here. But I knew better. I had already learned that no matter how much I succeeded, no matter how hard I fought to prove myself, it would never be enough to earn his full attention. I'd spent years chasing after the idea of what it would be like to have him proud of me. But at some point, I realized it was a race I would never win. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. It was 2 days before Christmas when I received the message that changed everything. I had just returned from the lab, my mind still racing with research data and clinical notes. My apartment felt like a quiet refuge, a place where I could get away from the world that seemed to constantly remind me of what I was missing. The success, the fellowship, it all felt empty without someone to share it with. And my father, the one person who should have been proud, had turned into someone I barely recognized. The phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was from my stepmother, Sarah. "Your dad wants to talk. It's urgent. Call him when you get a chance." I hesitated. My first instinct was to ignore it. Maybe he was just trying to patch things up. Maybe it was just another attempt to keep up appearances. But something inside me told me to call, to at least hear him out. I dialed his number, each ring like a drum beat, counting down the time until I would have to face whatever new version of him this conversation would reveal. "Hey, kiddo," Dad answered, his voice sounding strained. The casual greeting felt out of place, given the weight of the silence between us. "Hi," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "What's up?" He sighed, and I could almost feel the weight of his emotions over the phone. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. I know I've been distant, and I can't pretend it hasn't hurt you. I've made some bad choices, and I want to fix things." I felt my heart rate quicken, the unexpected vulnerability in his voice disarming me. Was this the apology I had been waiting for all these years? Or was this just another way for him to excuse his actions? "Dad, you don't just get to fix things with a conversation. It doesn't work that way," I said, the bitterness creeping into my voice before I could stop it. "You've been absent, and not just physically. You cut me off. You chose them over me." He was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear him breathing heavily, perhaps processing my words. "I know, Audrey, I know," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I've made so many mistakes. I lost sight of what mattered most, and it's cost me. It's cost us." The words hung in the air between us. My mind raced. Was he really apologizing? Did he understand the weight of what he had done, or was this just a reaction to my success? "I know I've missed so much of your life, and I've taken you for granted," he continued. "But I can't help but feel that I'm too late. You've built your life without me, and I respect that. But I also need you to know that I regret how everything went down. You deserved better." There it was, the apology. It was painful and raw, but there was something else there too. A crack in the armor. Something had shifted in him. Some realization that the life he had chosen wasn't everything he'd imagined it would be. "I didn't need you to be perfect," I said quietly, my voice shaking slightly with emotion. "I just needed you to show up, to care when it mattered." "I didn't know how to fix things, Audrey," he admitted, the words stumbling out as if he had been holding them back for years. "I thought by giving Sarah and the kids everything, I could create a new life, one that didn't have all the pain from before. I thought if I focused on them, it would be easier." "Easier for you, you mean?" I replied, my tone sharp. "I had to live with your choices. You don't get to erase the past just by showing up now, and you don't get to pretend like you didn't make me feel invisible." There was a long pause. I wasn't sure where this conversation was going, or if it would even end in something that resembled reconciliation. "Is it too late for us?" he asked, his voice a whisper now. I closed my eyes. The question hit me like a punch in the gut. I had spent so long trying to make sense of our relationship, trying to find some thread of connection between us, but in the end, he had chosen to walk away. He had chosen the easy path, the one that didn't involve confronting the hurt he caused. Now, here he was, asking if it was too late, as if I was supposed to somehow heal all the wounds he had created over the years. "I don't know, Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's not too late, but it's going to take more than a phone call to fix this. You don't just get to walk back into my life because I've succeeded. I've had to work for everything I've accomplished, and that's something you need to understand." I could hear the sorrow in his voice as he responded.
I know, and I'm sorry for not being there, for not seeing that. There was nothing else to say. The conversation had come full circle, and while I wasn't ready to forgive him, part of me felt a little lighter. He had finally admitted the truth, and it was the first step towards something, though I wasn't sure what that something would be. Maybe we can try, I said quietly, but it'll take time. I'll wait, he said, his voice full of remorse. For as long as it takes. I didn't respond. I just let the silence fill the space between us.
So tell me more about this fellowship, Audrey, my father said, trying to break the silence. His voice lacked the enthusiasm that should have accompanied such news. I'm sure it's a big deal. I swallowed hard, fighting the bitterness that rose up in me. I had worked so hard to get here, and yet the acknowledgement felt hollow. It wasn't the fellowship that bothered me. It was his casual dismissal of everything that led to this point. The sacrifices, the late nights in the lab, the missed birthdays, the lonely holidays. But I kept my voice steady, the mask of composure firmly in place. It's a big step forward, yes, I said, trying not to let the emotion slip through. It's one of the most prestigious research positions in the country. There was a pause. Dad nodded, but his smile was tight, and I could see the guilt in his eyes. It wasn't enough for him to say he was proud. It wasn't enough to apologize for the years of neglect. He was too busy trying to pretend like it didn't matter, like we could just pick up where we left off, as if nothing had changed. The dinner conversation shifted, and I noticed that my step-siblings were taking more of the spotlight. They were chatting away, laughing and joking as if there had never been a divide. They were living the life my father had chosen, one without me. And I realized in that moment that this wasn't about trying to reclaim something we once had. This was about me finally accepting that my life was no longer a part of his. He had made his choices, and I had made mine. And though the pain of those choices would never fully fade, I had to learn to live with it. I didn't need his approval to prove my worth. I had earned everything I had without him. I was standing on my own, and that had to be enough. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. It hurt more than I cared to admit. It wasn't until later that night, as everyone was preparing for bed, that I finally had a moment alone with my father. The house had quieted, the sounds of laughter and chatter fading into the background. We were standing in the living room, near the fireplace, the glow of the flames casting shadows on the walls. I wasn't sure why I did it. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the overwhelming feeling of defeat, or maybe I just couldn't hold it in anymore, but I spoke. Dad, you've missed everything, and you don't get to fix it with a few words. You've never been here. You've always chosen them. And I've had to live with that. I've had to grow up without you. He looked at me, eyes wide, and for the first time in years, I saw something in them I hadn't expected. Remorse. I know, Audrey, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I've made so many mistakes. I thought that if I just gave everything to Sarah and the kids, I'd be making things right. But I didn't see that I was losing you. I didn't realize what I was doing until it was too late. I shook my head, tears threatening to spill over. You didn't lose me because of them. You lost me because you didn't see me. You didn't believe in me. I had to prove everything to you, and you weren't there to see any of it. I didn't need a new family. I needed you. He stood there for a moment, his face twisted in regret. Then, finally, he spoke. I'm sorry, Audrey. I can't change the past, but I want to try. I've seen what you've accomplished, and I want to be part of your life again, if you'll let me. The words hung between us. For the first time, they felt real. They weren't a quick fix. They weren't a band-aid over years of hurt. But they were a start. I don't know if I can, I said softly, my voice trembling. You've been gone for so long. I've built my life without you. I can't just forget that. I don't expect you to, he said, stepping closer. But I want to be here for the future. If you'll let me. There was a long silence, filled only with the crackling sound of the fire. I looked at him, at the man who had been absent for so much of my life. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to run away from him. I didn't know if I was ready to forgive him, but I could try to move forward. We could both try. I hung up the phone, feeling both drained and strangely relieved. He hadn't fixed anything yet, But something had shifted. Maybe we could find our way back to each other, but it would take more than just a conversation. It would take trust, something that had been broken and buried under years of neglect and regret. As I stared at the screen of my phone, I felt the weight of the decision before me. My career was moving forward. I was succeeding in ways I had once only dreamed of. But was success enough to fill the void left by a father who hadn't been there? I wasn't sure. But for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward. The first step, though, was for him to prove that he could be there. For real this time. The days after the conversation felt strangely quiet. I kept returning to our talk in my mind, picking apart his words, trying to make sense of the emotional weight they carried. I wasn't sure what I expected from the apology, but it wasn't this. It wasn't a quick fix or a neat resolution. It was messy. It was a beginning. But that's all it was, a beginning. The following week, I received a message from Katie, my younger sister. It was simple, just a text. But it hit me harder than I expected. Mom and Dad want you to come over for Christmas this year. They're sorry, they really want to make things right. For a moment, I thought about it, about going home, about facing my father, about seeing my old life through the lens of everything that had changed. But the weight of the past felt too heavy. It wasn't just a holiday invitation, it was a plea for reconciliation. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that. I could almost hear my father's voice from the phone call echoing in my head. His promise to try, to be there. But I had heard words like that before. I'll change. I'm sorry, Lau Per. But none of it had ever lasted. So I did what I had always done. I buried my emotions in my work. The Patterson Fellowship was coming up. Everything I had dreamed of. The recognition, the mentorship, the opportunity to change the course of my career. I had built my success with my own hands. But I knew, deep down, that if I went back to that Christmas dinner, I would need more than just an apology. I would need more than just a recognition of my achievements. But something inside me was starting to shift. I wasn't sure if it was the success or the sheer exhaustion from keeping my father at arm's length. But I was beginning to wonder if I was ready to try again, to see if there could be something real between us, even after all the years of hurt. I finally made the decision to go. It wasn't for them, not entirely. It was for me. I wanted to see if there was room for forgiveness, room for us to rebuild what had been broken. I wasn't sure it would work, but I wasn't ready to live with the regret of never trying. Walking into my parents' house felt like stepping back into a life I barely recognized. The smell of pine from the Christmas tree, mixed with the rich scent of roasted turkey and mashed potatoes. The warmth of the house hit me instantly, but it felt different this time. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken words, expectations, and the weight of everything that had transpired over the years. I had prepared myself for this moment, but nothing could have truly prepared me for the reality. My father stood by the doorway, his arms slightly outstretched in an awkward attempt at a hug. It was as if we were strangers trying to find our way back to familiarity, and neither of us knew where to begin. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice laced with uncertainty. His eyes were tired, but there was something in them I hadn't seen in a long time, regret, maybe, or longing. It was hard to read. "I'm glad you came," I nodded, stepping into his embrace for a brief, stiff hug. I could feel the tension between us, and it wasn't just because we hadn't spoken in so long. It was everything that had happened, everything he had taken from me. But I also realized with a sharp pang that I wanted to believe this could be a new beginning. Maybe not everything could be fixed, but maybe some things could. Mom appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron as if nothing had changed. Her smile was bright, but there was a nervous energy behind it. "Audrey, it." The dinner table was set. There was the same old holiday spread: turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, and the cranberry sauce that I had always loved as a child. But tonight, it all felt like a performance. My father and mother were playing their parts, trying to pretend like everything was okay. The step-siblings were quiet, watching the awkward dance unfold. I took my seat at the far end of the table, next to my father, who hadn't quite figured out how to act around me. His gestures were too deliberate, as if he was afraid of doing or saying the wrong thing. The next few months were an emotional roller coaster. My father made every effort to rebuild what had been broken, but I knew that it would take time. His actions spoke louder than any apology could, and slowly, piece by piece, I allowed myself to trust him again. I kept moving forward in my career, focusing on the fellowship, on the research that had become my life. And while I was no longer seeking his approval, I couldn't deny the part of me that longed for his validation. For once, though, I didn't need it to define me. I had learned to validate myself. One day, after months of silence, my father called to ask if I would come to a conference in Baltimore, where my work was being featured. The way he spoke to me on the phone, with genuine pride in his voice, was different from anything I had heard before. "I'm so proud of you, Audrey," he said. "I don't think I ever told you that enough." And maybe that was enough. Maybe this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when I could let go of the hurt and embrace the future. Not just with him, but on my own terms. We had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, I felt like there was hope. I had come so far, and now, perhaps, I could finally allow myself to move forward without fear, without regret. My life was mine to navigate, and I would navigate it with or without him. But for now, there was room for something new, something that didn't depend on the past.